When a major corporation prioritizes quarterly profits over environmental sustainability, when artificial intelligence algorithms perpetuate systemic biases, when global wealth inequality reaches unprecedented levels while technological innovation accelerates exponentially, these aren't abstract philosophical dilemmas. They're the defining ethical challenges of our interconnected era, demanding sophisticated discourse and nuanced analysis from educated global citizens. Welcome to Artificial Fluency Podcast. I'm Olivia, and this episode represents the pinnacle of our linguistic journey, an exploration designed for advanced English learners at C1 and C2 proficiency levels who are ready to engage with the most complex and consequential topics of our time. Today's discourse transcends conventional language learning. We're embarking on an intellectual expedition through the labyrinthine landscape of global ethics and social responsibility, examining how individual choices reverberate through interconnected systems to shape collective outcomes. This episode represents a synthesis of linguistic sophistication and substantive content, designed to challenge your analytical capabilities while expanding your communicative repertoire. We'll navigate four interconnected domains. First, we'll examine corporate social responsibility and the tension between profit maximization and stakeholder welfare, analyzing how multinational corporations navigate ethical obligations in an increasingly scrutinized global marketplace. Then, we'll delve into the ethical implications of technological advancement, particularly artificial intelligence and data privacy, exploring how innovation intersects with human rights and societal values. Next, we'll investigate environmental ethics and intergenerational justice, considering our moral obligations to future generations in the context of climate change and resource depletion. Finally, we'll analyze global inequality and social justice movements, examining how systemic disparities perpetuate and how grassroots activism challenge established power structures. By episode's conclusion, you'll have mastered over 100 sophisticated lexical items, navigated complex syntactic structures, and developed the analytical vocabulary necessary for nuanced discourse on contemporary global issues. Shall we commence this intellectual odyssey? Let us begin by examining the paradigmatic shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism, a transformation that has redefined corporate accountability in the 21st century. Conceptual framework and terminology. Corporate governance paradigms. Shareholder primacy. Shareholder primacy, the doctrine that corporations exist primarily to maximize shareholder value. Stakeholder capitalism, a system where companies serve all stakeholders, including employees, customers, suppliers, and communities. Fiduciary responsibility. Fiduciary responsibility, legal obligation to act in the best interests of another party. ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance factors used to evaluate corporate sustainability. Triple bottom line, accounting framework considering people, planet, and profit. The traditional Milton Friedman doctrine, which posited that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, has undergone substantial reconsideration. Contemporary scholarship and stakeholder activism have prompted a fundamental reassessment of corporate purpose, challenging the assumption that profit maximization inherently serves societal interests. Advanced corporate responsibility vocabulary. Ethical business practices. Due diligence, comprehensive investigation and risk assessment. Transparency, openness and accountability in operations and decision-making. Whistleblowing, reporting of wrongdoing within organizations. Greenwashing, superficial or misleading environmental marketing. Stakeholder engagement, meaningful consultation with affected parties. Corporate citizenship, companies' role as a responsible member of society. Sustainable development, meeting present needs without compromising future generations. Regulatory and compliance framework. Corporate malfeasance, wrongdoing or misconduct by corporate entities. Regulatory capture, when regulatory agencies are dominated by the industries they regulate. Compliance framework, systematic approach to adhering to laws and regulations. Audit trail, documentation of financial and operational activities. Risk mitigation, strategies to reduce potential negative impacts. Grammar focus, advanced conditional and subjunctive constructions. Third conditional with modal prefecture. Had corporations adopted stakeholder capitalism earlier, we might have averted some environmental crises. Were companies to prioritize long-term sustainability over quarterly earnings, they would likely achieve more resilient business models. Mixed conditionals for complex causality. If shareholder primacy had never dominated corporate governance, environmental degradation would be less severe today. Should corporations fail to address social inequality, they will face increasingly stringent regulatory oversight. Pause. Case study analysis. Patagonia's stakeholder-centric model. Olivia. Consider Patagonia's approach to corporate responsibility. The company has consistently subordinated short-term profitability to environmental advocacy, donating annual profits to climate action, implementing radical supply chain transparency, and actively discouraging unnecessary consumption through their Don't Buy This Jacket campaign. This paradigm challenges conventional business wisdom by demonstrating that principled leadership can generate both ethical outcomes and sustainable profitability. However, critics argue that such approaches are feasible only for companies with established brand loyalty and premium pricing power.
Complex argumentation structures. Concessive clauses for nuanced positions. While stakeholder capitalism represents a progressive evolution in corporate thinking, nevertheless, its implementation faces significant structural impediments. Although ESG investing has gained substantial momentum, critics contend that it merely constitutes sophisticated virtue signaling. Causal sophistication. The proliferation of corporate sustainability initiatives stems not merely from altruistic motivations, but rather from pragmatic recognition of reputational risks. Insofar as companies depend on social license to operate, they must demonstrate genuine commitment to stakeholder welfare. Corporate accountability mechanisms, internal governance, board independence, non-executive directors free from management influence, executive compensation clawback, recovery of incentive payments based on misconduct, sustainability reporting, disclosure of environmental and social impact metrics, ethical leadership development, training programs for moral decision-making, stakeholder representation, inclusion of diverse voices in government structures, external oversight, shareholder activism, investor pressure for corporate reform, NGO monitoring, civil society surveillance of corporate behavior, regulatory enforcement, government sanctions for compliance failures, consumer boycotts, market-based punishment for unethical practices, media scrutiny, journalistic investigation of corporate conduct. The tension between profitability and social responsibility manifests most acutely in multinational corporations operating across diverse regulatory environments. Companies face the ethical dilemma of whether to adhere to the highest standards globally or to exploit regulatory arbitrage opportunities in jurisdictions with weaker oversight. Advanced grammar. Nominalization for academic discourse. Converting verbs to sophisticated noun phrases. The company's failure to address. The company's dereliction in addressing. Because they prioritize profits. Given their prioritization of profits. They decided to implement. Their implementation of. The practice of avoiding taxes. Tax avoidance practices. Complex syntactic embedding. The phenomenon whereby corporations systematically externalize environmental costs while privatizing economic benefits exemplifies the structural contradictions inherent in contemporary capitalism. Emerging challenges in corporate ethics. Technological disruption. Algorithmic bias. Discriminatory outcomes from automated decision-making. Data sovereignty. Control over information collection and usage. Platform responsibility, obligations of digital intermediaries, artificial intelligence governance, ethical frameworks for AI deployment, cybersecurity, protection of stakeholder data and infrastructure, global supply chains, labor exploitation, unfair working conditions in production networks, supply chain transparency, visibility into sourcing and manufacturing, human trafficking, forced labor in global production, environmental degradation, ecological damage from resource extraction, regulatory arbitrage, exploiting differences in national regulations. The complexity of modern supply chains creates what scholars term moral distance, the psychological and practical separation between decision makers and the consequences of their choices. When a consumer purchases an inexpensive garment, they participate in a network that may include exploitative labor practices, environmental degradation, and community displacement, yet the causal connections remain largely invisible. Contemporary ethical frameworks, consequentialist approaches, utilitarian calculation, maximizing overall welfare across stakeholders, cost-benefit analysis, quantifying trade-offs between competing interests, long-term optimization, considering extended temporal consequences, deontological perspectives, categorical imperatives, universal moral principles regardless of outcomes, rights-based frameworks, protecting fundamental human dignity, duty ethics, obligations derived from role and relationship, virtue ethics applications, character-based leadership, decisions reflecting moral virtues, institutional integrity, organizational commitment to ethical principles, prudential judgment, practical wisdom in complex situations, grammar focus, advanced relative clauses and participle constructions, non-restrictive relative clauses for additional information. Patagonia, which has pioneered environmental activism in corporate settings, demonstrates how businesses can profitably pursue social missions. The Business Roundtable's 2019 statement, wherein CEOs redefined corporate purpose, marked a watershed moment in stakeholder capitalism. Reduced relative clauses for conciseness. Companies adopting stakeholder capitalism often outperform those focused solely on shareholder returns. The principles underlying ESG investing reflect growing awareness of systemic risks. As we conclude this examination of corporate social responsibility, consider this paradox. The very success of stakeholder capitalism may depend on maintaining market-based incentive structures that originally prioritized profit maximization. This suggests that meaningful corporate reform requires not merely moral exhortation, but fundamental restructuring of economic institutions. In our next segment, we'll explore how technological advancement compounds these ethical complexities, particularly in the realm of artificial intelligence and data governance. We now turn to perhaps the most consequential ethical frontier of our era, the intersection of technological capability and moral responsibility, where unprecedented power to shape human experience demands equally unprecedented wisdom in its application. Foundational concepts in digital ethics, artificial intelligence and machine learning, algorithmic accountability, responsibility for automated decision-making systems, explainable AI, artificial intelligence systems whose decisions can be understood by humans, bias amplification, the tendency for AI systems to exacerbate existing societal prejudices, training data integrity, the quality and representativeness of information used to develop AI systems, autonomous agency, the capacity of AI systems to make independent decisions, superintelligence, hypothetical AI that surpasses human cognitive abilities across all domains. The fundamental challenge of AI ethics lies not in the technology itself, but in its capacity to operationalize and scale human biases at unprecedented speed and scope. When facial recognition systems demonstrate racial bias, when hiring algorithms discriminate against women, when predictive policing perpetuates systemic inequalities, we witness the materialization of societal prejudices through technological amplification. Data governance and privacy, information rights and sovereignty, data fiduciary, entity with legal responsibility for data protection, informed consent, meaningful agreement to data collection based on full understanding, data minimization,
collecting only necessary information for specified purposes. Right to erasure, ability to request deletion of personal information. Data portability, transferring personal data between service providers. Surveillance capitalism, business model based on commodifying personal information. Digital rights framework, privacy by design, incorporating data protection from system inception. Algorithmic transparency, openness about automated decision-making processes. Digital dignity, respect for human autonomy in digital interactions. Technological self-determination, individual control over digital experiences. Computational fairness, equitable treatment in algorithmic systems. Grammar focus, advanced passive constructions and ergative verbs. Sophisticated passive voice for academic discourse. Personal data is systematically harvested, processed, and monetized without meaningful user comprehension of these processes. Algorithmic decision-making systems are being deployed across critical domains before their societal implications have been adequately assessed. Ergative verbs for discussing technological change. Privacy norms have eroded rapidly under sustained commercial pressure. Democratic institutions are adapting slowly to digital disruption. Social media platforms have evolved into arbiters of public discourse. Case study, the Cambridge Analytica paradigm. The Cambridge Analytica revelations epitomized the convergence of data harvesting, psychological manipulation, and democratic subversion. The scandal illuminated how personal information, collected under the guise of academic research, could be weaponized for political micro-targeting, potentially influencing electoral outcomes in multiple democracies. This case demonstrates the concept of data externalities, the societal costs of information collection and processing that are not borne by the entities that profit from these activities. When individual privacy violations aggregate into threats to democratic processes, we observe how personal data becomes a matter of collective concern. Complex ethical reasoning structures. Conditional probability in ethical discourse. Given the propensity for AI systems to perpetuate historical biases, the likelihood of achieving algorithmic fairness approaches zero. Provided that current data collection practices continue unregulated, the probability of maintaining meaningful privacy rights diminishes exponentially. Counterfactual reasoning. Had comprehensive data protection regulations been implemented prior to the proliferation of social media platforms, the contemporary surveillance economy might never have emerged. Were algorithmic decision-making subject to the same transparency requirements as human judgment, public trust in automated systems would likely be substantially higher. Platform governance and content moderation. Content moderation. Policies and practices for managing user-generated material. Algorithmic curation. Automated selection and ranking of information. Filter bubbles. Information environments that confirm existing beliefs. Echo chambers, spaces where similar views are reinforced and amplified. Viral misinformation, false information that spreads rapidly through networks. Deplatforming, removing users or content from digital services. Democratic implications, information asymmetry, unequal access to relevant knowledge. Epistemic crisis, breakdown in shared standards of truth and evidence. Democratic discourse, public deliberation essential to democratic governance. Digital public sphere, online spaces for civic engagement and debate. Technological solutionism, belief that technology can solve complex social problems. The governance of digital platforms presents what legal scholars term a Collingridge dilemma. Early in technological development, we have maximum control but minimum information about consequences. Later, we have maximum information but minimum control. This temporal paradox complicates efforts to regulate emerging technologies responsibly. Advanced lexical sophistication. Academic hedging and qualification. Ostensibly, apparently but perhaps not actually. Purportedly, allegedly or claimed to be. Presumably, probably but not certainly, conceivably, possibly but not definitely, putatively, generally considered to be. Intensification and emphasis, quintessentially, representing the most perfect example, unequivocally, without doubt or ambiguity, categorically, Absolutely and without exception, manifestly, clearly and obviously, inevitably, unstoppably and inevitably. Grammar focus, advanced conditional structures and modal meanings. Hypothetical conditionals with past reference. If comprehensive AI governance frameworks had been established before machine learning proliferated, we would not be confronting these regulatory challenges today. Should current trends in surveillance technology continue unabated, civil liberties will face unprecedented erosion. Modal verbs for epistemic possibility. Artificial intelligence could conceivably revolutionize education, though it might equally well exacerbate existing inequalities. Technological solutions may appear to address social problems while actually obscuring their underlying causes. Emerging technological challenges. Artificial intelligence governance. AI alignment problem, ensuring AI systems pursue intended objectives. Value loading, programming ethical principles into AI systems. Instrumental convergence, tendency for AI systems to pursue similar subgoals. Orthogonality thesis, intelligence and goals are independent variables. Existential risk, threats to human survival or flourishing. Biology and enhancement, genetic engineering, direct manipulation of DNA sequences. Cognitive enhancement, technological augmentation of mental capabilities. Longevity research, scientific efforts to extend human lifespan. Bioethics, moral principles governing biological research and application. Enhancement equality, fair access to human augmentation technologies. The prospect of human enhancement technologies raises profound questions about distributive justice. If cognitive or physical augmentation becomes available but expensive, will we witness the emergence of biological castes? How do we prevent technological advances from calcifying existing inequalities or creating new forms of discrimination? Cybersecurity and digital warfare, information security, cyber vulnerabilities, weaknesses in digital systems, state-sponsored hacking, government-directed cyber attacks, critical infrastructure, essential systems vulnerable to disruption, information warfare, using information to damage opponents, cyber deterrence, preventing attacks through threat of retaliation. Digital rights in authoritarian contexts. Digital authoritarianism, using technology to enhance governmental control. Internet censorship, restricting access to online information. Surveillance state, comprehensive monitoring of citizen activities. Social credit systems, scoring citizens based on behavior monitoring. Digital resistance, using technology to oppose authoritarian control. Complex syntactic structures for sophisticated argument. Participial phrases for conciseness. Having recognized the limitations of technological solutionism, policymakers are increasingly emphasizing human-centered design principles. Faced with unprecedented ethical dilemmas, technology companies are belatedly developing corporate responsibility frameworks. Absolute constructions for circumstantial information. Current regulations being inadequate to address AI governance challenges, new legislative frameworks require urgent development. Privacy rights having been systematically eroded through surveillance capitalism, restoring digital autonomy demands comprehensive reform. As we conclude this exploration of technological ethics, we must acknowledge that these challenges transcend national boundaries and traditional regulatory approaches. The global nature of digital technologies demands international cooperation, yet competing national interests often impede collaborative governance efforts. The ethical frameworks we develop today will determine whether emerging technologies amplify human flourishing or exacerbate existing inequities. In our next segment, we'll examine how these considerations intersect with perhaps our greatest collective challenge, environmental sustainability and intergenerational justice. We now confront what may be the ultimate test of human moral reasoning, our obligations to future generations in the context of anthropogenic climate change and ecological degradation. This challenge demands that we expand our ethical frameworks beyond immediate stakeholders to encompass both non-human nature and unborn humans. Foundational environmental ethics concepts, philosophical frameworks, anthropocentrism, biocentrism, ecocentrism, deep ecology, environmental justice, intergenerational equity,
climate science and policy, anthropogenic forcing, tipping points, carbon budget, radiative forcing, climate sensitivity, paleoclimatology. The concept of intergenerational justice poses profound philosophical challenges. How do we weigh present costs against future benefits? What obligations do we bear toward people who do not yet exist? These questions become particularly acute when we consider that climate change represents the largest market failure in human history, a global tragedy of the commons where individual rational behavior produces collectively irrational outcomes. Advanced environmental vocabulary, ecological economics, ecosystem services, natural capital, sustainable yield, circular economy, degrowth, green accounting, environmental governance, precautionary principle, polluter pays principle, subsidiarity, environmental subsidiarity, transboundary pollution, global commons. Grammar focus, subjunctive mood and advanced conditional constructions. Subjunctive for hypothetical scenarios. Were we to implement comprehensive carbon pricing globally, emission reductions would accelerate significantly. Had humanity heeded early climate warnings in the 1970s, current mitigation costs would be substantially lower. Complex conditional chains. If current emission trajectories persist unabated, and if climate sensitivity proves to be at the upper end of current estimates, then catastrophic warming becomes virtually inevitable. Should technological breakthroughs in carbon capture materialize, and should political will for implementation emerge, humanity might yet avoid the most severe climate scenarios.
Case study: the ethics of geoengineering. Solar radiation management, the hypothetical deployment of reflective particles in the stratosphere to reduce incoming solar radiation, exemplifies the ethical complexities of technological intervention in Earth systems. This approach could theoretically mitigate warming rapidly and inexpensively, yet it would create unprecedented global governance challenges. Who would control planetary thermostats? How would we manage differential regional impacts? What obligations would we bear to maintain such systems indefinitely? The prospect of geoengineering illustrates how technological capabilities can outpace institutional wisdom, creating moral hazards that may exceed the problems they purport to solve. Advanced grammatical structures for complex reasoning, concessive relationships. While geoengineering technologies offer theoretical climate solutions, they nevertheless pose unacceptable governance risks. Despite mounting evidence of ecological collapse, political systems remain inadequately responsive to environmental imperatives. Causal sophistication. Climate change results not merely from individual consumption choices, but rather from systemic features of industrial capitalism that externalize environmental costs. Insofar as economic growth depends on resource throughput, infinite growth on a finite planet remains logically impossible. Environmental justice and equity, distributional considerations, environmental racism, disproportionate environmental burdens on racial minorities, climate vulnerability, susceptibility to climate change impacts, adaptive capacity, ability to adjust to climate change effects, loss and damage, climate impacts beyond adaptation limits, climate debt, historical responsibility for cumulative emissions, common but differentiated responsibilities, principle recognizing varying national capabilities, rights-based frameworks, rights of nature, legal recognition of natural entities as rights-bearing, ecocide, criminal prosecution of severe environmental destruction, environmental personhood, granting legal standing to natural features, guardianship models, humans as trustees of natural systems, future generations' rights, moral and legal claims of unborn people. The rights of nature movement represents a paradigmatic shift from anthropocentric legal frameworks toward ecocentric governance models. When Ecuador constitutionally recognized nature's rights, when New Zealand granted legal personhood to the Wanganui River, when Colombia's constitutional court protected the Amazon rainforest, these decisions challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Complex argumentation patterns, analogizing reasoning. Just as we now condemn historical slavery, despite its former legal acceptance, future generations may judge our ecological destruction as morally unconscionable. Climate change mitigation resembles vaccination programs. individual actions that benefit collective welfare while imposing personal costs. Dialectical development. Thesis: economic growth enables human flourishing. Antithesis: unlimited growth destroys ecological foundations. Synthesis: qualitative development within planetary boundaries. Advanced lexical sophistication for environmental discourse. Academic precision. Inexorable, unstoppable and inevitable, climate change. Palpable, so intense as to be physically felt, environmental anxiety. Imminent, about to happen, ecological tipping points. Irreversible, impossible to undo, species extinction. Unprecedented, never done or known before, rate of change. Sophisticated hedging, ostensibly, apparently, but perhaps not actually. Conceivably, possibly, but not certainly. Plausibly, reasonably, but not definitively. Arguably, it could be argued that. Presumably, probably, but not proven. Technological solutions and moral hazard. Green technology assessment. Renewable energy transition, shift from fossil fuels to sustainable sources. Carbon capture and storage, removing CO2 from atmosphere or emission sources. Nuclear power renaissance, renewed interest in atomic energy for climate mitigation. Synthetic biology, engineering organisms for environmental applications. Artificial photosynthesis, technological mimicry of plant CO2 conversion. Innovation ethics, technological determinism, belief that technology drives social change. Social construction of technology, recognition that social factors shape technological development. Innovation governance, managing technological development for societal benefit. Responsible innovation, anticipating and managing innovation consequences. Technology assessment, systematic evaluation of technological implications. The promise of technological salvation creates what economists term moral hazard, the tendency for protection from risk to encourage greater risk-taking. If societies believe that future innovations will solve environmental problems, they may delay necessary behavioral and systemic changes, potentially worsening ultimate outcomes. Global governance challenges. International environmental law. Paris Agreement. International climate accord with nationally determined contributions. Tragedy of the commons. Individual rational behavior producing collective irrationality. Free rider problem. Benefiting from others' environmental protection without contributing. Climate finance. Funding for developing country mitigation and adaptation. Technology transfer. Sharing clean technologies across borders. Institutional innovation. Earth system governance. Institutions for managing planetary scale changes. Polycentric governance. Multiple decision-making centers at various scales. Deliberative democracy. Citizen participation in environmental decision-making. Anticipatory governance. Institutions designed to manage future challenges. Transformative capacity. Ability to create fundamentally new development pathways. Complex temporal constructions. Past perfect continuous for historical analysis. For decades, scientists had been warning about climate risks before policymakers began taking meaningful action. Indigenous communities had been practicing sustainable resource management long before Western science recognized its value. Future perfect for consequence projection. By 2050, we will either have achieved carbon neutrality or will have committed future generations to catastrophic climate change. The decisions we make this decade will have determined whether human civilization maintains its current trajectory or undergo fundamental transformation. As we conclude this examination of environmental ethics, we must acknowledge that climate change represents more than an environmental challenge. It constitutes a civilizational test of humanity's capacity for collective action and moral reasoning across temporal and spatial scales. The frameworks we develop for environmental governance will determine not only the habitability of our planet, but also the moral foundations of global society. In our final segment, we'll explore how these environmental challenges intersect with questions of global inequality and social justice.
We now examine the most persistent and morally urgent challenge of our interconnected world, the systematic persistence of extreme inequality alongside unprecedented aggregate wealth, and the social movements that challenge these disparities while reshaping global consciousness about justice and human dignity. Structural analysis of global inequality. Economic dimensions. Wealth concentration, accumulation of assets among small elite populations. Income inequality, disparities in earnings and compensation.
Intergenerational mobility, ability to improve socioeconomic status across generations. Capital returns versus labor returns, differential growth rates between investment and wages. Financialization, increasing dominance of financial markets over productive economy. Rentier capitalism, economic system where wealth derives from ownership rather than production. Systemic mechanisms. Structural adjustment programs, economic policies imposed on developing countries. Tax avoidance strategies, legal methods to minimize tax obligations. Regulatory arbitrage,